It was an ordinary night in Winsford, the kind of evening that passes unnoticed, folding quietly into the rhythm of daily life. But for one young woman, that night would mark the last time she was seen alive. Nora Kellerman drove into the dark curves of Evermont Pass, a familiar road that would soon become the stage of an unsolved mystery. Her car was found lightly damaged, her belongings untouched, and yet she had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no struggle, no sign of what happened in those critical minutes. Investigators scoured the area, analyzed sporadic phone signals, and pieced together fleeting clues, but the questions only multiplied. How does someone disappear so completely in a place so ordinary yet so unforgiving? This is the story of a night, a road, and a disappearance that continues to haunt everyone who tries to understand it. There are nights that begin like every other, quiet, unremarkable, folded into the rhythm of a life we believe we understand. And then, there are nights that quietly split a timeline in half, turning an ordinary person into a name spoken in investigations, online forums, and late-night conversations among strangers who never knew them. For Nora Kellerman, that dividing line began on an ordinary Tuesday, March 12, 2019. In the hours before she disappeared, Nora moved through her routine with the calm efficiency of someone who had no idea her life was heading toward a sharp, irreversible turn. She woke in her small studio on Willow Avenue, brewed a cup of instant coffee, skimmed through her clinical exam notes, and vacuumed the apartment earlier than usual. A detail her neighbor would remember later, not because it mattered, but because investigators asked him to remember every detail. Throughout the day, Nora seemed normal. Her classmate noted she looked focused, maybe a bit tired, which wasn't unusual for students nearing exam week. There were no outbursts, no odd remarks, no signs of distress, nothing that hinted she was carrying a secret or stepping into danger. That evening, she left campus at 6:17 p.m., stopped by a convenience store for a protein bar and a bottle of water, both of which were later found unopened in her car, and then drove west. By 7:02 p.m., her phone connected to a tower near the outer edges of Winsford, confirming she wasn't heading home or toward her workplace. She was going somewhere else entirely. She was heading toward the mountains, toward the cold, narrow strip of asphalt known as Evermont Pass, a place locals avoided after dark for reasons rooted in practicality, not superstition. Almost no traffic, near zero cell service, and temperatures that dropped fast once the sun disappeared. Why Nora drove there remains one of the central questions of her case. Investigators later traced her path through time-stamped surveillance footage, her silver hatchback leaving Winsford's main road, the headlights cutting across the foothills, the car carving a smooth, deliberate arc toward the isolated pass. Nothing about her movements suggested panic or confusion. Everything suggested intention. And yet, only a few hours later, her car would be found lightly damaged against a tree on a frozen curve of Evermont Road, its door open, the engine cooling, her belongings untouched inside, while Nora herself was gone. No footprints in the snow, no trail leading into the woods, no sign of a struggle. Just the impression of a young woman who had been there moments before, and the unsettling stillness of a place that held no answers. Where are you watching this video from? Leave your location in the comments below. I'm always curious how far these stories can travel and how they manage to connect us across every distance. And now, let's continue the story. By the time Nora left the last streetlight of Winsford behind her, the night had settled into that deep, quiet cold that only mountain towns understand. The kind of cold that sharpens every sound and makes even the most familiar roads feel slightly foreign. Cameras captured her car for the last time at 7:26 p.m., gliding past a shuttered gas station on the outskirts, the headlights washing over empty parking lots and silent storefronts. Beyond that point, surveillance coverage thinned out, and Nora's world narrowed into a two-lane road that wound steadily upward into the foothills. Investigators would later reconstruct the drive, the long curves, the patches of frost along the guardrails, the brief pockets of darkness where the cliffs pressed too close for moonlight to reach. It was a lonely stretch, but Nora kept a steady pace. No swerving, no braking, no sign of hesitation, just a consistent, deliberate climb. At 7:51 p.m., her phone pinged one final tower near the base of Evermont Pass. After that, the signal vanished completely, swallowed by the terrain. This wasn't unusual. Service in the area was notoriously bad, but it created the first of many blank spaces in the timeline, the kind that investigators would spend months trying to fill. Traffic records show almost no vehicles that night. Only two others passed through the lower section of the pass around the same time, both heading downhill. Neither driver reported seeing Nora's car. Neither remembered crossing another set of headlights. It was as if she drove into a pocket of isolation that belonged only to her. What stands out from that night is how ordinary the conditions were. No storm, no ice thick enough to cause widespread accidents, no reports of animals on the road or debris forcing sudden maneuvers. Just a calm, cold night on a mountain route that rarely saw visitors after dark. Yet Nora continued deeper, far beyond the point where most people would turn around. At 8:14 p.m., her car would reach the section of road where guardrails disappear and the forest begins to press closer, branches hanging low over the asphalt like a slow, dark canopy. That part of Evermont Pass has a way of making people feel watched, though patrol officers insist it's only the acoustics, the way sound travels strangely in the valley, echoing back in thin, distorted layers. But even without superstition, there was something undeniably lonely about that road, a kind of quiet that made the slightest movement stand out. By 8:37 p.m., according to the estimated timeline, Nora was nearing the upper bend of the pass, a place where tire marks from her car would later be found angling slightly toward the shoulder. The reason for that drift, whether intentional or not, remains unknown. What is known is this: she was still in control, still driving, still alone. Still headed toward the moment her car would veer off the asphalt and come to rest, lightly damaged against a tree. The upper section of Evermont Pass is the kind of road where time seems to stretch. No houses, no passing cars, no ambient glow from distant towns. Just a ribbon of asphalt threading through trees that grow denser with every mile. Sometime between 9:35 and 9:45 p.m., Nora reached one of the most isolated bends on that route, a shallow curve with a narrow shoulder and a drop-off hidden beneath layers of brush. Investigators would later determine that her car drifted slightly to the right, the tires catching loose gravel just enough to nudge the vehicle off its intended line. The impact itself was minor. A small dent to the bumper, a scrape along the passenger side, no shattered glass, no deployed airbags. It was the sort of collision that startles a driver, but leaves them fully capable of stepping out to assess the damage. And that's exactly what Nora seemed to have done. Her hazard lights were found switched on. The driver's door left ajar, the engine cooling but not dead. Whoever opened that door had done so calmly, not in a panic, not in a rush. The first and last known witness to see Nora alive was a man named Daniel Harrow, a local resident driving home from a late shift. His route took him down the mountain, and at approximately 9:52 p.m., just minutes after the impact, he noticed the glow of hazard lights flickering between the trees. He slowed, expecting to find a stranded motorist or a deer accident. Instead, he saw a young woman standing beside a silver hatchback, her arms folded tightly against the cold. Daniel would later tell investigators that she looked alert, not injured, maybe a little shaken. He rolled down his window to ask if she needed help. She responded with a quick shake of her head and a small gesture that suggested she had already called for assistance. There was nothing alarming about her behavior, nothing desperate or frightened, nothing that hinted at what would happen next. Daniel continued down the mountain, making a mental note of the location so he could report it if needed once he reached better signal. It took him 8 minutes before his phone reconnected to a tower. At 10:01 p.m., he placed a non-emergency call reporting a minor roadside accident with a young woman who seemed fine. The dispatcher logged it routinely and sent the nearest patrol unit. The patrol car began heading toward Evermont Pass at 10:04 p.m. It would arrive at Nora's location at 10:13, exactly 21 minutes after Daniel had seen her standing safely beside her car. And in those 21 minutes, she disappeared. No movement captured on the road, no approaching headlights, no witnesses passing by, no sound reported by nearby cabins, because there were no cabins, When the officer stepped out into the cold night air, all he saw was an empty road, a lightly damaged car, the driver's door still open, and the unmistakable sense that someone had been there only moments earlier. By the time the patrol car rounded the bend of Evermont Pass at 10:13 p.m., the night had deepened into an almost tangible quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, that makes each footstep, each rustle of leaves, feel louder than it should. The officer, a veteran named Sergeant Kellen Ross, slowed as he approached the flickering hazard lights of the silver hatchback. His eyes swept the scene carefully. The tires had scraped the shoulder slightly. The bumper bore a faint dent. Nothing out of the ordinary for a minor roadside collision. But what immediately struck him was the absence of any person. The driver's seat was empty. The door swung gently in the cold wind. Nothing moved. No footprints led away from the car in any direction, despite the recent snowfall covering the shoulder. The keys were still in the ignition. The protein bar and water bottle Nora had bought were untouched in the passenger compartment. Ross circled the car, radioing for backup. A second unit would arrive within minutes, but the first moments were surreal. The place where a young woman had stood so clearly minutes before was now nothing. No disturbance in the snow, no shadow, no indication of a path through the woods. Just the car, half on the asphalt, half on gravel, and the immense silent darkness of the surrounding forest. For the next hour, officers conducted an initial search of the immediate area. They shouted her name. They scanned with flashlights across the tree line, across the downward slope of the mountain, across the guardrails. Nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not a trace that she had moved from the exact spot Daniel Harrow had seen her. The only clue, if it could be called that, was a faint set of tire marks, the slight angle of the car toward the shoulder, suggesting she may have stepped out, adjusted the vehicle, and then simply vanished. Calls were made to nearby residences. No one reported unusual movement. No one heard a struggle. By 11:30 p.m., the road was closed to traffic, lights from patrol cars reflecting on the wet asphalt, but still no sign of Nora. And in those hours, the scene itself became a haunting reminder. Sometimes, the most ordinary locations can hold the most extraordinary mysteries. Once it became clear that Nora was missing, the quiet of Evermont Pass transformed into something heavier, almost tangible. The initial shock of the empty roadside lingered, but the officers immediately organized a search, calling in additional units and volunteers from the local community. Flashlights cut through the darkness in uneven beams, reflecting off frost-coated branches, illuminating small patches of snow that seemed undisturbed, yet somehow full of possibilities. Canines were brought in, trained to track scent, their noses low, tails stiff, ears alert. The dogs picked up faint traces, but the signals were inconsistent, leading one team a few dozen meters into the forest before abruptly losing the trail. The rocky terrain, dense trees, and icy undergrowth made every step dangerous and slow. Teams shouted Nora's name into the night, their voices swallowed by the surrounding mountains, echoing back in strange, distorted layers. Every shadow seemed to hint at movement. Every rustle of branches drew sharp glances, yet nothing concrete appeared. Her footprints should have been visible in the thin layer of snow near the shoulder, yet there were none. Investigators would later describe the scene as if she had stepped out of reality itself. By midnight, search teams had extended the perimeter nearly a mile in every direction, but the mountain pass yielded nothing. No sign of struggle, no sign of passage, no indication that anyone else had approached. Only the cold, the trees, the distant hum of the highway far below, and the quiet persistence of a young woman who had disappeared without a trace. As the hours dragged on, volunteers huddled in vehicles for warmth, occasionally venturing back into the dark. Every noise was noted, a snapping branch, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind slipping through the pines. Every possibility was considered. Had she wandered into the woods voluntarily? Had she tried to descend the slope? Had someone else been involved? But for the night itself, all answers were impossible to reach. The search teams would continue through the early hours. But the first night on Evermont Pass set the tone for what would become a months-long investigation. As dawn approached, the search teams began reviewing every detail of the night. The forest around Evermont Pass was dense, uneven, and treacherous, but they had to follow every lead, no matter how faint. It was then that the first clue emerged, subtle and almost invisible, the faint tracks of a shoe in the thin frost along the road shoulder. They weren't fresh, and they didn't appear to extend far into the forest. Instead, they ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into nothing. The pattern was brief, inconsistent, and left more questions than answers. Meanwhile, digital detectives began analyzing Nora's phone records. Her last pinged tower from the previous evening had been near the base of the mountain. After that, the signal disappeared, swallowed by the dead zone of the pass. But later, sporadic signals were detected at intervals from locations 30 to 40 kilometers away, locations that made little sense given the estimated time she could have traveled on foot. Investigators speculated about the possibilities. Had she been picked up? Had she moved faster than expected? Or had someone else been involved? They cross-referenced her last known movements with the timing of the phone pings. Nothing added up. Every route, every path, every travel scenario seemed to contradict the timeline or the physical limitations of the terrain. The digital traces painted a pattern that was fragmented, almost like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. It was the first concrete hint that Nora had not simply wandered into the forest and gotten lost. Something else had occurred, something that remained invisible to the naked eye. As the investigation stretched into days, detectives began to look beyond the immediate events of Evermont Pass. They spoke to friends, classmates, neighbors, anyone who had interacted with Nora in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. What emerged was a portrait of a young woman who, by all appearances, had led a normal life. She attended classes, worked part-time, and kept meticulous notes for her clinical rotations. Yet beneath the surface, there were small habits, quiet routines that hinted at a private inner world, one that nobody outside her immediate circle fully understood. She was an early riser, often seen walking alone at dawn with her headphones in, taking notes in a small leather-bound journal. She rarely discussed her plans beyond the next few hours. She preferred walking paths and mountain roads, places she described to friends as places to think, though nobody had accompanied her there. Investigators pored over entries in her journals. They were detailed, logical, sometimes reflective, but always careful not to reveal personal struggles or relationships. No overt signs of distress, no dramatic confessions. Simply the patterns of a thoughtful, self-contained individual who valued her independence. Some entries mentioned her fascination with local geography and weather patterns, notes, oyans, roads and trails she had walked or driven, observations that seemed innocuous at first but would later become points of reference in reconstructing her route. Friends recalled her sometimes choosing to take longer, less traveled paths, even when a shorter route was available. It was part of her habit of moving deliberately, even cautiously through the world. None of it suggested she would put herself in danger intentionally. And yet, all these details, the careful planning, the solitary routines, the awareness of the terrain, added to the mystery of her disappearance. Nora was not careless. She was meticulous. She was aware. She was deliberate. And still, she vanished. Days into the investigation, detectives turned their attention to the few locations Nora had passed on her way up Evermont Pass. One of the first places they reviewed closely was the shuttered gas station at the lower edge of the mountains. The convenience store's cameras had captured her car that night, silver headlights cutting through the darkness, moving steadily along the road. But as they reviewed the footage frame by frame, a detail stood out. At approximately 7:27 p.m., shortly after Nora passed the station, a second vehicle appeared on camera. It was a gray sedan, the make and model difficult to determine, but its presence was unmistakable. The car followed Nora for several seconds in the footage, then turned off before reaching the same bend where the collision would later occur. Detectives tried to trace the sedan's path. There were no matching license plates on file, and no eyewitnesses could recall seeing it in the area. It was as if the car existed only to appear in that brief moment on camera, a silent observer on the edge of Nora's journey. Investigators debated what this could mean. Had someone been watching? Had the sedan been involved in some way, or was it mere coincidence? They examined traffic cameras further down the mountain, but the gray vehicle was nowhere to be seen again. Combined with the erratic phone pings and the abrupt disappearance at the accident site, the footage added a new layer of mystery. For the first time, the notion that Nora's disappearance might involve another person could not be dismissed entirely. Yet, nothing in the video indicated any direct interaction. No stopping, no attempt to contact, nothing to suggest aggression, only presence, silence, observation. By the second week after Nora's disappearance, investigators had amassed a mountain of evidence, and yet none of it pointed to a clear explanation. The initial theories ranged from the simplest to the seemingly improbable, but all had to be considered. One possibility was that she had wandered into the forest and become lost. Yet the terrain was familiar to her. Her habits suggested caution, her knowledge of local trails was precise. The faint frost tracks near the shoulder hinted at movement, but they ended abruptly. There was no sign of a struggle or fall. The wilderness theory, though natural, quickly ran into contradictions. Another theory considered the gray sedan seen on the gas station camera. Could someone have intercepted her after the collision? If so, why leave no trace at the roadside? No witnesses had reported a second vehicle in the vicinity during the narrow window after Daniel Harrow passed, and the timing would have required precise coordination. Then came the analysis of her phone signals, sporadic pings from locations inconsistent with pedestrian travel. If she had been moving alone on foot, the timing didn't add up. If someone else was involved, the pattern became slightly more plausible, but still frustratingly inconclusive. Detectives also explored accidental scenarios. Had she been struck by a passing car, dragged off the road, or fallen into a hidden ravine? Terrain surveys and search teams found no evidence of any of these possibilities. Even search dogs lost her scent quickly, as if it had been removed or interrupted. In private, investigators began comparing the case to similar unsolved disappearances on remote roads, isolated accidents, vanishing motorists, but none matched perfectly. Each lead created more questions than answers. And yet, one pattern persisted. The combination of deliberate driving, sudden disappearance, faint physical evidence, and unexplained electronic signals. Investigators quickly realized that understanding the window of time Nora had after leaving her car was crucial. From the moment she was last seen standing beside the hatchback at 9:52 p.m. until the first search teams combed the area, barely over 20 minutes had passed. In a place as cold and isolated as Evermont Pass, that was both a short and a critical period. Specialists analyzed the terrain, the narrow bends, the slopes, the pockets of forest and brush. Even a physically fit person would move slowly over uneven ground, especially in near-freezing temperatures. Hypothetically, Nora could have reached the forest edge within minutes, but then she would encounter dense undergrowth, steep inclines, and the kind of obstacles that quickly separate a person from a clear path. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined her last known clothing and footwear, suitable for casual driving, but not for a long trek over rugged mountain terrain in the dark. Any extended exposure increased the risk of hypothermia or injury. Investigators considered her options. She could have sought higher ground to make herself visible, followed the road back toward the lower pass, or hidden in the immediate surroundings, waiting for help. None of these possibilities matched the evidence. Search dogs could not track her for long. There were no additional footprints, and nothing indicated she had attempted to signal for assistance. It was as if, in those brief 20 or 30 minutes, Nora moved from a known, solid location into a situation where the usual rules of movement, tracking, and observation no longer applied. Every calculation, every estimation only highlighted how narrow her survival window was and how easily the terrain could conceal someone who knew the roads well but was suddenly on foot in the dark. As days turned into weeks, Evermont Pass itself became a character in the investigation. Those who knew the road described it as beautiful, treacherous, and strangely quiet after dark. There were no streetlights, no nearby homes, and only the occasional road marker to guide travelers. But it wasn't just the isolation that gave the pass its eerie reputation. Residents spoke of subtle anomalies, animals avoiding certain sections, winds that carried sound in odd directions, and stretches where even seasoned drivers felt an unexplainable disorientation. These were not tales of ghosts or superstition. They were practical observations, rooted in the way the terrain funneled sound, in how shadows fell across bends, and in how fog could roll in unexpectedly from the forested slopes. For investigators, these factors mattered. They explained how a person could disappear from view so quickly, even in a small area. The road's sharp curves, coupled with the dense tree line, made it easy to be hidden from anyone approaching from another direction. Slight changes in elevation, combined with temperature inversions, could distort the perception of distance, making a person appear closer or farther than they actually were. Emergency calls from that stretch often reported drivers losing orientation, mistaking the road's subtle contours, or missing small pull-offs. It was within these characteristics that Nora's disappearance found a kind of plausible concealment. The pass was ordinary enough to drive, but treacherous enough to obscure a person completely within minutes, especially when the road had so few witnesses. Weeks had turned into months, and yet Nora Kellerman's disappearance remained a puzzle that refused to be solved. Every lead, every trace, every signal only seemed to deepen the mystery. Investigators had mapped her journey from her apartment to the convenience store, to the lower edge of Evermont Pass, to the bend where her car had veered slightly off the asphalt. They had studied the frost tracks that ended abruptly, the sporadic phone signals, and the fleeting presence of the gray sedan captured on a security camera. Nothing connected neatly. Nothing gave them the closure they needed. Theories abounded, each plausible, yet incomplete. She could have wandered into the forest and become disoriented. She could have encountered someone else along the road. She could have taken the only route that left almost no trace, a path that the human eye or even trained dogs could fail to detect. Each possibility carried its own set of implications, but none provided certainty. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. For the community of Winsford, Evermont Pass became a place to avoid after dark, a stretch of road that no longer seemed ordinary. For the investigators, it became a lesson in the limits of observation, in the ways terrain, timing, and circumstance can conspire to make a disappearance nearly invisible. Friends and family of Nora continued to hope, to theorize, to hold on to the possibility of a miraculous return, but each day that passed made the absence more absolute. And for anyone who followed the case, online discussions, podcasts, news segments, the story became an example of how ordinary choices, ordinary roads, and ordinary nights could produce outcomes that defy comprehension. No supernatural force had intervened, no dramatic confrontation had been witnessed. Only the cold, quiet night, the shadowed curves of Evermont Pass, and a young woman who simply vanished. Part 12 ends with questions that have no answers, and with a reminder that some mysteries remain unresolved, not because of negligence, but because reality itself can be quietly, relentlessly elusive. Nora Kellerman's disappearance is, and may always remain, a study in the impossible, the way a life can be meticulously ordinary and yet vanish without a trace, leaving only the echoes of what was, the glimmer of what might have been, and the unshakable pull of unanswered questions that linger in the mind long after the road has been cleared, the search called off, and the night returns to its silent, watchful state.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next videos, where we continue to follow the mysteries that have never slept. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned